Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Johnny's Ambassadors Expert Webinar Series for Parents. I am blessed to be the founder and CEO of Johnny's Ambassadors, Laura Stack, where we educate parents and teens on the dangers of today's high-potency marijuana on adolescent brain development and suicide ideation. This session is being recorded. There is also a handout which you can access in the control panel, kindly provided by Dr. Eric Messamore, whom I will introduce in just a moment. He has kindly offered to answer any questions that you have, if time permits. At the end, he has a great deal of content to go through. So in your control panel, there is a questions box where I encourage you to enter your questions as you think of them, and I will read off as many as we can at the end of today's session. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Eric Messamore, who is the Medical Director for the Best Practices in Schizophrenia Treatment Center at Northeast Ohio Medical University, where he is an Associate Professor of Psychiatry. He is a medical doctor with board certification in psychiatry and holds a PhD in neuropharmacology. Dr. Messamore specializes in the fields of psychopharmacology, complex mood orders, psychosis, and schizophrenia. He has been quoted by the Associated Press, Malcolm Gladwell, and the U.S. Surgeon General. And we are blessed to also have him on the Scientific Advisory Board for Johnny's Ambassadors. Dr. Messamore, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks for having me, and thanks to all of you who are watching this webinar. I very much appreciate your interest in this very important topic. I'm going to talk today about the fact that cannabis actually really can cause psychosis, and I will explain how it happens. First, I've noticed when I talk about cannabis that some people think I'm doing this because I have some angle on pharmaceutical companies wanting to keep it illegal, or that I'm with some other group that want to maintain prohibition. I want to be clear. I get no money whatsoever from any industry for anything. I'm not getting any compensation. I'm not involved with any policy advocating groups. I've actually, people might find this difficult to believe, voted and signed every petition that will liberalize cannabis policy and will allow for adults who are informed to exercise free choice to do what they want regarding this substance, because that's what democracy and free choice is about. This is my opinion, and speaking of opinions, the things I'm going to say are my ideas, my thoughts, and data that I've, scoured up and serving to you. This is not having anything to do with the opinions, views, or positions of Northeast Ohio Medical University. So with those out of the way, brief overview, I'm going to tell you what is schizophrenia and what is psychosis. I'm going to outline the evidence that says that cannabis can cause psychosis for a number of people who use it. I'm going to explain how that works. And then I will talk about schizophrenia, which is, you'll see, related but different to psychosis, and I'll explain the links between schizophrenia and cannabis use, and we'll then talk more at length about the links between these two entities, or three entities: cannabis, psychosis, and schizophrenia. I've been doing science and psychiatry for many, many years, and I actually began my practice of psychiatry in cannabis-friendly Oregon. And I didn't really think a whole lot about it until I started to notice that a lot of my patients in long-term state hospital care that I can usually get better, the ones that I could do very little for, had very much in common adolescent onset and longer term, like multi-year regular cannabis use. And so that got me wondering, is there something about this pathway to schizophrenia which is different, or which makes it far more difficult to treat? I also, in the course of my consultation practice, would meet people who should never have come to see me. 30-year-old lawyers, 40-year-old engineers, men in their 30s and 40s, never developed psychosis. And yet I was seeing all these people. And again, they had in common adolescent onset, regular and protracted cannabis use. So that got me looking into stuff. And as I began to speak about it, I became convinced that people just need to know the science. And these data speak to this need. Actually, 1/3 of American adults think it is healthy, that it promotes health benefits to smoke or vape cannabis. Half of US adults say that cannabis has no potential for any potentially serious risks. And this is the part that alarms me. 2/3, in a 2019 survey, 2/3 of adolescents thought that marijuana has no ability to potentially cause any serious health effects. Then you have, of course, the boosters from people like, ironically, they call themselves the voice of the responsible cannabis industry, a lobbying organization called National Cannabis Industry Association. Their media spokesperson went on the record in a media interview saying it just doesn't happen. So ignoring it, denying it, not being aware of a risk doesn't make the risk go away. It just means that more people are going to learn about the risk through experiencing it. And when it comes to psychosis or schizophrenia, this is something that you don't want to have firsthand experience of knowing about. So let's move on now to explain psychosis. So psychosis is a word that we hear a lot, but never really gets explained a lot. Consequently, a lot of people just don't quite understand what's going on. So I would like to spend a bit of time now telling you what psychosis is and how it happens. First thing to say about psychosis, I call it the most common problem that nobody talks about. It's more common than most people could believe. Surveys peg the odds of you, me, or somebody that we know experiencing some facet of psychosis in our lives at about 1 in 11. That's a pretty high risk. It's especially likely to make its onset during adolescence, and it is about, the likelihood in a given year that a teenager will experience psychosis is about 3 times more likely than a female teenager giving birth, is about 9 times more likely than getting a diagnosis of diabetes, type 1 or type 2, and is over 300 times more likely than dying of suicide. So the fact that people are shocked to hear this usually, again, is a testament to the fact that we don't talk about it. And I think that we should, because it's common and it's something that our brains can do. The other thing to say about psychosis is that psychosis is a symptom, just like fever is a symptom. So it's something that we can recognize relatively easily, but that has dozens or hundreds of causes. Fever indicates that the body has turned on an inflammation response. Psychosis is a sign that the brain is processing information inefficiently. And when the brain is engaged in inefficient information processing, it is quite likely to generate clusters of misperceptions. When misperceptions occur in the parts of the brain that generate sight, sound, touch, smell, these result in spontaneous sensations that have no connection to external stimulus. We call those hallucinations. Again, that's just a misperception in a sensory part of the brain. A lot of the brain real estate is devoted to understanding the significance of things. And when we attach misperceived significance to things that are not significant, then we will start to develop beliefs to explain those misperceptions, and those unusual beliefs get the unfortunately stigmatizing name delusions. It's pretty easy for the brain to generate misperceptions because the brain takes in about 11 million bits of information every second from everything around you and everything inside of you. All these bits of information are constantly being fed into the brain, but conscious experience, the part that you're aware about and think about, that area of the brain processes information at about 50 bits per second. So a massive condensation of raw data into refined data, and in that process, there can be, some things going wrong. So let me give you some examples of how the brain may generate misperceptions that can lead to delusions. So this is a picture. Look at the picture. You have automatically ascertained that this lady is inviting you into her office. And you didn't even notice that there's more than 50 bits, 50, informational elements at least in this image. Your brain said, forget the soft cushions, forget the wrinkly knees, forget the empty garbage can. I know immediately what I'm doing. That's the gift of rapid information processing. Our brain has certain circuits that it uses to hone in on the important stuff, and certain chemical messengers are released in the process of alerting ourselves to what is important. Dopamine is one of those chemicals that is very, very important in signaling importance. So, in that scene that we saw, we filtered out a whole bunch of other stuff that wasn't relevant, and our brain let us know that this woman in the foreground with her arm extended and the chair in the background that she's pointing to, these are key elements which lead the brain to easily conclude I'm being invited into this office. Now, let's imagine that the brain, the information processing circuits have become hyperactive because they're getting too much chemical input from dopamine, for example. In that case, let's say that now we perceive immediately that the woman and the clock and the garbage can and the plant are all compellingly important. The other stuff we're not paying attention to. We're focusing on trying to put these things together. These things don't normally belong together. The brain, in addition to trying to identify immediately the important stuff, also immediately needs to come up with explanations for why these things are fitting together. And since these things don't normally belong together, we'll come up with creative ideas. So maybe she's pointing to clock, which means time, and there's a plant and there's a garbage can. Maybe the plant is in danger of being thrown away. Maybe this means that there's an imminent disaster that will affect plant life. Or if I have a more, say, optimistic psychological temperament, maybe the plant has come out of the garbage. Maybe this is kind of like a resurrection sign, and maybe the woman is pointing to it's time for a rebirth of life, and I can be elated rather than scared because I have now been given special insight into this new world of meanings. So again, these are perfectly valid explanations to explain stuff that doesn't normally fit together. And in the first example, we lead to suspiciousness or paranoia. In the second example, we lead to elation or grandiosity. And this explains why we see paranoid ideas or grandiose ideas as common thought themes that happen during psychosis. So to summarize psychosis, it's a symptom that can have dozens or hundreds of causes. In fact, probably more than 100 drugs can have psychosis as a side effect. More than 50 medical diseases can produce psychosis as a symptom, and several psychiatric conditions are associated with psychosis. Psychosis revolves around misperception, and if the misperceptions occur in sensory experience, we call those hallucinations. If the misperceptions are related to importance of significance or impotence of emotional attachment, we can generate ideas to explain those, and those ideas are called delusions. That's what psychosis is. Let's now talk about schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is, in contrast to being purely a symptom, schizophrenia is the name of a medical diagnosis. Not going to go into the special considerations of this, but just call it schizophrenia as a diagnosis that has as a symptom psychosis. In addition to psychosis, schizophrenia is characterized by being a longer term condition, which is associated with functional decline. And very important, to make a diagnosis of schizophrenia, doctors have to carefully look for other potential causes, like one of those 50 medical diseases or one of those 100 drugs. But so schizophrenia is a condition, not a symptom. Now, having explained what psychosis is, let's talk about cannabis being able to cause psychosis. And to get to cannabis being able to cause psychosis, let's talk about the pharmacology of cannabis. Cannabis itself these days is a very confusing term, and marijuana, which is a colloquial name, equally confusing. In the old days, shall we say, cannabis or marijuana referred to plants that have a particular shape of flower and leaf, and that in many cases can produce euphoric or psychoactive experiences. These days, in modern legislature, marijuana or cannabis in every state whose laws that I have read means anything that comes out of a cannabis plant. So 90% THC concentrate can be called marijuana under state laws, which leads to confusion. But the most important ingredient, the thing that makes cannabis more interesting to human beings than broccoli, and the ingredient that the majority of cannabis consumers are interested in is tetrahydrocannabinol, abbreviated THC. Why THC makes cannabis more interesting than broccoli is because THC mimics a chemical that our brains make naturally. That brain chemical is called anandamide. Anandamide is part of what we call an endocannabinoid system. So our brains are able to generate this anandamide, which works on certain kinds of protein receptors to control cell activity. THC can essentially hijack that system and directly stimulate those receptors, which are called cannabinoid or CB receptors. A lot of explanations sort of end there, but I think it's important to ask what next. So when THC activates the cannabinoid receptors, the most important thing is it changes how those cells behave. Most importantly, it tends to decrease the release of some very important neurotransmitter signaling molecules. And these CB receptors are located in brain areas which are massively important to generating those perceptions of sensation, those perceptions of emotion, and those perceptions of significance. So we'll talk now about some of the chemical interactions specifically. Let's talk about dopamine. I alluded to dopamine as the chemical that signals circuits to pay attention, to know that something is important. And we have a ton of data from human beings that experience psychosis or from schizophrenia. And those data include neurochemical studies, genetic studies, positron emission tomography scans of human brains that say again and again that people that are psychosis prone or that are experiencing psychosis tend to make more dopamine and release more dopamine than the average person does. Cannabis does the same thing. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but for many people, at least in the beginning of cannabis use, it can significantly accelerate the output of dopamine. And I won't belabor this, but if you don't believe me, there are 3 papers that you can go look up online, and you can read all about the evidence that says that in human beings that use cannabis, that it stimulates the release of dopamine. So also, interestingly, you can look at these papers, which are in the fine print here. We know that if we give THC to pregnant rats, we will see that we change the activity of dopamine-making cells in the rat pups after they're born. We have human data that say that women who are using cannabis during pregnancy are causing in the brains of their unborn children to change the expression of dopamine receptors in a way that we would expect if we are driving excessive dopamine activity in a developing brain. And we have some longer-term studies of kids that were born to women who were using cannabis during pregnancy, who were born to women who were using cannabis during pregnancy. And if you give them sort of psychological testing of thinking habits, you'll find that cannabis-exposed kids, or in utero cannabis-exposed kids, have psychosis-prone habits of thinking. These may all be related to this dopamine theory that I'm putting out here. So basically, to summarize the dopamine aspect, we know that excessive dopamine activity, dopamine hyperactivity, is a very important cause for the majority of cases of psychosis that we see, and cannabis can mimic that action. So there's overlap between pharmacology of cannabis, technically pharmacology of THC, and the biochemistry of psychosis. Here's a very important neurotransmitter that many people have not heard about. But in terms, if you count the number of connections between brain cells, things that are called synapses, the majority, more than 50% of connections in the brain utilize glutamate to send messages to each other. So in terms of the number of connections that use it, glutamate is far and away #1 neurotransmitter in human brain. Glutamate is, I say, it's like a gas pedal because it always drives excessive activity. It makes cells more excitable once they are stimulated by glutamate. Glutamate is a sort of fast-acting excitatory signal, and the parts of the brain that generate perceptions use a lot of glutamate to do that kind of neuronal processing to generate those perceptions. Glutamate is also massively involved in directing cell growth in the brain and in strengthening the synapses that form the basis of human memory, of memory, not just human memory. So that's all very important stuff. We also know that drugs that interfere with the glutamate signal very reliably cause psychosis. Ketamine and PCP are classic examples of drugs which interfere with glutamate signaling. And remember I talked about the CB receptors. When THC binds to the CB receptor, the primary action of that interaction is to make a cell that makes glutamate to put out less glutamate. So glutamate, THC is a glutamate inhibitory drug. And this is an extremely interesting study that was published just last year. They got human volunteers with no prior history of mental illness. They gave them THC and they put them into a special kind of brain scanning apparatus, which allows us to measure glutamate chemicals in the brain. Two things were interesting in this study. That number one, 70% of human volunteers, again, volunteers with no history of mental illness, experienced transient psychotic-like symptoms after they got their THC injection. And the ones that had psychosis experiences had biochemical signatures that glutamate was being manipulated. The pattern was such that the ones that were vulnerable to psychosis effects of THC probably had overly active or more active glutamate systems at the time of the injection, and they had a bigger impact in terms of inhibiting glutamate release as a result of the THC. So glutamate is massively important in the generation of psychosis, and here we have, red-handed in a brain scan, glutamate changes being correlated with the onset of psychosis in human volunteers given THC. I'm going to talk briefly about GABA because glutamate is the number one neurotransmitter in terms of cell connections that utilize it. GABA is number two, utilized by 30% to 40% of cell connections in the brain. GABA is like the brake. So if glutamate was the gas pedal to make cells more active, GABA is the polar opposite. It slows down cells or can stop their activity for a while. And THC, in addition to inhibiting the release of glutamate in glutamate-making cells, inhibits the release of GABA in GABA-making cells. So I call this like taking the foot off the brake. Lots of brain areas utilize GABA. One very important one is called the amygdala, which is the textbook, like all the textbooks on anatomy, all the textbooks on psychiatry of anxiety point to the amygdala as kind of like the master region for anxiety assignment and anxiety generation. So if you take the foot off the brake in the amygdala, then you have the possibility of revving up that anxiety engine, and that may explain why panic and anxiety is a very common side effect of THC or cannabis. And here we have another study, again using brain imaging in human beings, to show that the people who experienced anxiety as a result of THC exposure had higher availability of the CB receptor. So in this case, THC is finding the CB receptor in the amygdala. It is turning, we assume, is turning down the output of GABA, which is like taking the foot off the brake of the amygdala, and it generates anxiety responses. We'll leave it at that. There's more to say about how that may relate to psychosis, but in the interest of time, we're moving on. So to recap, the two primary mechanisms whereby there are many more mechanisms, but the two that are best documented and make the most sense are the mimicking the action of dopamine excess and mimicking the action of glutamate inhibition. THC gooses dopamine, decreases glutamate, and that mimics the biochemistry of psychosis. So we have now the neurochemical basis to suspect that THC in cannabis can cause psychosis. What's the actual evidence that this really happens in real life? Well, it's been around a long time. we're, nowadays talking about medical marijuana. That's really old news in the United States as well as in Europe. From the middle of the 1800s to the beginning of the 20th century, we all knew in my profession, the profession of medicine, we knew that this is a medicinal substance. And in 1850, 1890, 1910, textbooks of medicine routinely talked about cannabis as a medical substance. One of the textbooks that I read actually advises doctors to keep 4 ounces of indica in your office and 1 ounce in your house call bag. Those textbooks from that era also explained how to store it, how to prepare it, how to use it, what to use it for, and like we learned how to do, because all medicines have risks, those textbooks talked about side effects and risks. And the thing that's interesting about looking at 19th century books is that this was a very drug-friendly time. We used cocaine, we used morphine, we used cocaine, we used opium, we used opium poppies, we used whatever we had. And so there wasn't a prohibitionistic atmosphere at the time. It was just another drug, and they were describing side effects like just another side effect. So here's some quotes from 4 textbooks of the day. Basically, they're talking about significant mental status changes, hallucinations, changes of behaviors that we would probably recognize as psychosis if we were writing these observations today. So that's that. We can also directly ask people who use cannabis, hey, has this ever happened to you? So as one example, this is a community survey in New Zealand. They went in one community to find 1,000 people, asked them if they've ever used cannabis. Of the ones that had, they asked them, they gave them a checklist, has this ever happened to you? So they asked them about this question, have you ever had strange, unpleasant experiences, such as hearing voices, or becoming convinced someone's trying to harm you, or that you're being persecuted? In other words, have you had a psychotic experience? 15% said yes, and 22% said that they'd had a severe anxiety or panic problem with it. So that it happens if you ask volunteers, and it happens with fairly high frequency, according to this survey. You can also, and this is not the only survey, many surveys have been done over the course of decades, and Green and colleagues in 2003 gathered up all those publications and tried to ascertain across all these different studies what are the liabilities for side effect risks. So aggregating surveys, looking at around 3,000 reports, about half of people who use cannabis reported at some point in their use they experienced paranoia, 20% hallucinations, notably 37% depression, 40% anxiety. So, I mean, it happens. If you ask the actual people who use it, you'll get that report. But does that prove anything that cannabis actually causes psychosis? So how do you go about proving something? Well, you could get a bunch of human beings who don't have mental illness, put them into a laboratory and give them controlled doses of cannabis extracts, or THC, and then carefully monitor them to see if signs of psychosis emerge. I mean, that's how you prove things. And they've done that. Here's a paper review article looking at more than 60 studies altogether, showing that across the board you see changes of perception, mood, cognition, brainwave changes that are identical to the things that you see in psychosis and schizophrenia. So that's one form of proof. You can also do the gold standard clinical trial. You can do double-blind, placebo-controlled study where you get a bunch of people, randomize them to 2 groups, and give them pills that are either the active substance or inert substance, placebo, and make it so that neither the patient nor the raters know who's getting what. That's how we test drugs for efficacy, and that's how we also generate side effect lists when we test new drugs for clinical use. THC is a drug that is used in clinical practice. It is approved by the FDA, and it did undergo clinical trials that are controlled by placebo groups. And if you go to the FDA website, or if you just Google Marinol prescribing information, you'll come up with this 20-some page description of THC pharmacology, therapeutics, and risks. And you'll see these are what are called common adverse reactions, meaning more than 1% of volunteers experienced paranoid reaction or hallucination. And the asterisk means that it had between 3% to 10% of volunteers experienced it. This was low dose medicinal use of THC, 2.5 milligrams twice a day. By comparison, the average US joint will deliver around 12 milligrams of THC, and that's not really that's just an average joint. So low doses for medicinal use gave you this rate of paranoia reaction and more than 1% of hallucinations. So there's that. So that's proof. You can also look to population studies where you look at psychosis as an outcome. This is a called meta-analysis. We're looking at many studies here, actually 10 different studies. Psychosis meaning in this case either sort of a few days or a few months of persistence, but you'll see across the study this relationship. The more a person is exposed to cannabis, the greater their odds ratio, the odds that they'll experience psychosis versus people who aren't exposed to cannabis again and again. Altogether, the average risk increase is between 3 and 4-fold. So there's that. So to summarize, we see consumer surveys, we see human clinical laboratory studies, we see placebo-controlled studies, we see dose exposure or exposure and risk relationships in population studies. Cannabis causes psychosis in some people. It's proven science. What about schizophrenia then? We remember schizophrenia is a persistent psychosis and what's the evidence for that? Well, we have this thing called the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. This is notably an independent organization it was founded by Congress in the middle of the 1800s to advise politicians about policy matters related to science, engineering, or medicine. In several stakeholders, including several states that have legal marijuana, asked the National Academies to generate an independent report about cannabis health effects. This is entirely free to read online, by the way. Just Google health effects of cannabis on National Academies and you'll get to the link. And this body reviewed a bunch of papers, and they conclusion number 12-1, substantial evidence of association between cannabis use and development of schizophrenia or other psychoses, with the highest risk among the more frequent users. Critics will say that correlation doesn't prove causation, and another argument is that it's only a concern for people that have genetic risk. So cannabis may be causing schizophrenia in people that are destined to have schizophrenia, goes the argument. So I'd like to address that argument now by referring you to this very great study. Great because you get 1,000 kids and you follow them across their life, making measurements every 3 years. So you can know who at the beginning had a mental illness, who not, who is using cannabis at the age of 15 and who not, who at the age of 26 has a psychotic disorder and who not. And so you eliminate a lot of some confounds from other designs if you follow a cohort prospectively, as they did in Dunedin, New Zealand. And we see, typical of many studies that do this, you see that people who had used cannabis more than 3 times had a 10% likelihood of having a psychosis-related disorder at age 26 versus 3% for those who didn't use cannabis. Now let's talk about the genes there, because this is where it gets very interesting. Follow-up study looked at one of those risk genes. By the way, there are 108, at least 108 genes that give rise to schizophrenia risk. So to say that cannabis-related schizophrenia or cannabis-related psychosis is only a concern in people that have genetic risk, well, with 108 genes, a lot of people carry at least a few of them. One of those genes is called COMT. COMT is the name of an enzyme that metabolizes dopamine. For our illustration here, we need to understand that COMT comes in 3 genetic forms, or 3 genetic flavors, if you will. We'll call them MET-MET, VAL-MET, and VAL-VAL. Each one of these has a different activity for dopamine metabolism. And here's the graph. So the dark bar is people who had used cannabis in adolescence, who were having a schizophrenia-like diagnosis at age 26. So you see cannabis users, cannabis non-users, there's no difference in the MET-MET flavor of genes. The people that had the Valmet combination of COMT actually saw a rise of schizophrenia diagnosis risk in the adolescent cannabis users, about 2.5-fold higher risk. In the people that had the Val-Val form of COMT, you see about a 10-fold elevation of risk for being diagnosed with a schizophrenia-like diagnosis at age 26. So cannabis users versus not for Val-Val. Great. So we've found in this study, we found a gene which absolutely looks like it confers the risk for schizophrenia as an outcome of adolescent cannabis use. Great. Here's the part that I think should give us all some pause for concern. 25% of the population carries that high-risk gene form. 50% carry the moderate risk gene form, and only 25% get lucky for this 1 out of 108 schizophrenia-related genes. So my point being that it may be true that it's only a concern for people who have genetic risk, but that genetic risk may be a lot more common than the implication of this statement would have you conclude. So to summarize that, it may be true that it's only a concern for people who have schizophrenia risk genes, but those genes may be more common. I also hear that we can look to family history of mental illness. So if you don't have a relative that had schizophrenia or a severe mental illness, then you're not going to have a risk of developing psychosis or schizophrenia. That is absolutely false. Most people who have schizophrenia, natural schizophrenia, actually have no relatives that had it before. And almost all of the cases that I know of individuals that have had severe cannabis-related psychosis or cannabis-related persisting psychosis or schizophrenia had no family history of mental illness either. So you can't use family illness to say that that determines the risk factor or not. And the other thing is that if I have a twin brother who has schizophrenia, and if he's an identical twin, I have 100% of his genes, meaning I have 100% of the genes necessary or sufficient to cause schizophrenia. My risk of having schizophrenia is only 50%. So the other part of the risk comes from the environment. Cannabis is very likely an environmental trigger that will bring forward latent genetic risk for schizophrenia. In other words, I can have 100% of schizophrenia genes, but never have schizophrenia if I don't have environmental exposures. So cannabis might be bringing forward cases of schizophrenia that would not otherwise exist, and that is the thing it's a strong hypothesis. We have more work to prove on it, but it's strong enough and the outcome is severe enough that I think everybody should be aware of this and not be so dismissive of the possibility. So coming back to, again, I'm just reciting arguments that I hear with frequency from folks who take the other side. Typically, I just call them optimists. But you can't prove it. And so this is the way that you prove something. And in fact, the only way that I think that this hardcore optimist would be satisfied is to do this experiment. Let's get about 20,000 young people. We'll have 10,000 of them smoke every day. In this case, we'll say smoke cannabis every day, and 10,000 smoke placebo cannabis every day. And let's follow them up in 10 years and see who has cancer or who has schizophrenia. So you cannot do a study like this. You can't set up a study where you're looking to prove a harmful outcome. So if you're waiting for that for proof, you will wait forever. You'll be using this argument, which is a false argument because you can't do that experiment. So what do you do in cases where you do have a harmful outcome? You can't do the definitive placebo-controlled study. So instead, you ask questions. Is it biochemically plausible that cannabis could cause psychosis or schizophrenia? Can we create those physiological changes in animals by giving them cannabis? Can we see features of schizophrenia in human volunteers given THC in laboratories? Do we see an association in the population? And do we see in populations a relationship between higher degree of exposure and greater risk of the outcome? And the answer, as the green bars say, yes, 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 and yes. I mean, every marker that we use for showing probable cause has been met and satisfied in the case of cannabis possibly being a causative agent for schizophrenia. So again, I showed earlier, It absolutely causes psychosis, not to everybody, but for some people. And it is there's a compelling case to take this very seriously, that cannabis can cause that cannabis can cause schizophrenia. The most charitable interpretation of the data is to say that cannabis will bring forward schizophrenia that would have occurred, but make it occur several years earlier, which is a disaster, because the difference between getting schizophrenia when you're 25 versus when you're 17 is a huge difference in prognosis. And probably, if we want to go with it's only harmful for people that have genetic risk, genetics is not destiny. There are people who have genetic vulnerabilities that if we could avoid environmental exposures, we could protect them from developing this illness. So again, there's enough here to take this very seriously. And let's talk about, if somebody develops a cannabis-related psychosis, what does that mean? Well, it means that that person's brain, their genetic structure, their wiring, their psychology is sufficient to have their brain engage in psychosis function. And data from Scandinavian countries, the data from Scandinavian countries is great because they have birth to death records in a unified healthcare system. So we can track these folks, or they can track these folks much better than we can in the US. So a study from Finland showed that of 18,000, the other thing about Scandinavian studies is you can do giant numbers. So of 18,500 people hospitalized with a cannabis-induced psychosis, following up years down the road, 46% of them had a schizophrenia-related diagnosis. Similar finding with similar numbers comes out of Denmark. In this case, look at 6,700 people who were hospitalized with cannabis-related psychosis, and 47% within several years were either diagnosed with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. In contrast, a very small study in which they had only 57 patients identified and 35 followed up, that study nonetheless showed that of people that had cannabis-induced psychosis, those who abstained went back to their life. They regained their function, and for the period of observation never got a severe psychiatric illness. Those who did go back to using cannabis ultimately progressed with a likelihood of about 50% to a more severe psychiatric diagnosis. So again, to summarize then, if somebody has an episode of cannabis-induced psychosis, this is probably the best indicator that that person or their family will have to say, this individual has the genetic vulnerability and or the psychological vulnerability and or the neurological makeup that makes psychosis a possibility. And if it can happen once, it can happen again. And if it can happen a short time, it potentially could happen a longer time. And so that's that. Then combine that with these epidemiological data from Scandinavia, which says that this is a warning sign that within 4 to 8 years, you have nearly half, 50-50 risk of having a severe mental illness, which the small Indian study said might be preventable if you can abstain. So this would be an episode of cannabis-induced psychosis should be a warning sign to the patient, to the family, to the medical community, to everybody, that this person should stop exposing themselves to risk factors and start to build up resilience factors. This might be the last best chance that somebody has to change their course. So to summarize finally, cannabis has many neurotransmitter actions. The ones on dopamine and glutamate are very strongly overlapping with the biochemistry of psychosis. How often it happens depends upon the dose and the setting and presumably the age and other factors, but anywhere between 1% and 20% of people who use cannabis will experience a cannabis-related psychosis, which then is associated with cannabis use is associated with tripling the risk of schizophrenia, and having an episode of cannabis-related psychosis puts you at about 50-50 odds of having a diagnosis of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder several years down the road. I know I just said this, but I'll say this again. This should be taken very seriously because it's biochemically plausible. I didn't go into the animal studies in the interest of time, but they are there. We can model physiological changes in animals that are reminiscent of those we see in psychosis in humans, proven in human studies, in human lab studies, and consistent with epidemiological data. Again, I come back to why I'm doing this in the first place. I'm a psychiatrist. I practice in Oregon. I've seen more than my fair share of people who say, I had no idea cannabis could do that. It breaks my heart because in many cases they had no idea that there was a psychosis risk, or that there was a panic attack risk, or that there was a severe persistent vomiting risk. These risks are actually very well known to science, but they don't get popularized in the media. And for sure, people like Morgan Fox at the National Cannabis Industry Association are doing everything they can to discredit them. This, again, it really makes me angry because this means that we're going to have people believing this is a safe, natural drug that is medicinal and healthy, when in reality, it, like every other drug, has some risks. And people just simply need to know that those risks exist. And it doesn't help as well, in my view, it doesn't help that states, 34 of them, have said officially marijuana is a medicine. And they treat it very much like a medicine. They involve committees to review diseases it can treat. They involve doctors in many cases. They have dispensaries that are regulated as if pharmacies. It has the trappings of medicine around it. So the average person is going to say, oh yeah, medicine, that's great. Medicine is something that is helpful and is reasonably safe. And every state that has a medical marijuana program has a website for the medical marijuana program. And here I tallied up the number of diseases that each state says that marijuana can treat. The average person is going to say it's good for 18, 20, 40 diseases. Across the board, the average number of diseases that states say it's good for is 18. But here, go to those medical marijuana websites and scour them and look for, are they saying anything about risks? 24 of the states on their medical marijuana websites, the place where consumers will go to learn about the substance, are completely silent on risk. So my message to you at the end is, again, this risk is real, and I'm glad you know about it. Please tell your friends about it, and probably tell your state, if they don't, broadcast the risk on their website or put it on the packaging. It's time to publicize these risks. If we're going to live with cannabis being legal in our society, which again, I think people should be free to make their choices, but they have to be informed choices. So if we're going to have it legal, we need to make sure that its risks are as widely publicized as the risk for guns, prescription medicines, automobiles, cigarettes, you name it. This is not a special drug. It's a very ordinary drug, and it has risks that people deserve to know.
Dr. Messmore, this is an excellent presentation, and I'm so glad that there are so many parents who can listen to this, because like me, I was unaware of the differences in THC and the products of today versus what in the 70s and 80s, a lot of us just assumed now would be the same level of safety as it was to us. You know, hey, nothing happened to me, or kids will be kids, or it's just marijuana, you know, not understanding the dangers of what is being on the market today. And so really appreciate that. We do have a couple of follow-up questions. One is, if you had to prioritize what kind of information should be made available at a point of sale type of purchase in today's commercial markets, should there be some sort of requirement to communicate the risks and side effects? What would you prioritize in that information?
Yeah, well, again, I guess the beautiful feature of being able to answer this question is that the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine is an independent organization, and they reviewed more than 10,000 papers for that report that is available online, and they list the quality of evidence behind each conclusion. So they just generated a list of scientifically credible adverse effects. That would be a beautiful place to start. And I would say that anything that the National Academies of Sciences rated as moderate quality evidence should go on the label and go on the warnings, because the NAS moderate quality definition was found in several credible scientific studies with no credible opposing publications. And for warning people, that's a good standard. We should also probably include a couple of things which are not on the National Academy's list, but are, and maybe may be rare, but are massively serious, like suicide risk and like cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. Those are known to science, and again, the outcomes are severe enough that I think we should warn people about the possibility.
Yes, and not just parents and users, but someone made a comment here, which is so true. Psychologists, psychiatrists, middle, high school staff, sadly, one of the psychiatrists that Johnny went to didn't even know about the connection. I don't think it's even widespread, even among the medical community. And of course, certainly those doctors who are providing med cards, and prescribing things such as pain and for anxiety, where in fact some of those things can increase, as you mentioned. What do you think is the potency that should be capped, if there is one, in the commercial market? Based on the research that is there anything that could be considered safe? As in the 70s and 80s, the percentage of THC in flower or bud was, 3%. In today's products, of course, up to 99% potent in distillates and extracts. Is there anything as professional, given everything you've presented today, that you would say we should cap it at this level, as anything over that is unsafe? Is there a safe level?
Well, this is, I mean, so there's a couple of things you brought up, which are very good points. Number one, that many doctors or many mental health or medical professionals don't know very much about the risks, and we don't know very much about what percentage or number or dose is quote unquote safe or not. And I believe this is a consequence of this longstanding prohibition of cannabis. Part of why I take the sometimes unpopular position that we should have it legal is because we're now living the consequence of 80 years of strict prohibition. Yes. So it went into a black market and it emerged, and so people who want to have it legal will say nothing but good things. And because it's been kind of underground and very, very difficult for scientists to study, we have no great information. So we have this weird time in history where it's more popular than probably ever before in all humankind's history, but the knowledge base that we have to inform these decisions is really small and not widely publicized. So imagine that had it been, like cigarettes, we would have figured this out a long time ago, and we would know, what's a safe level. We would know the risks, and we would have a better gauge upon safety, so that state policymakers could make, decisions as they do. Alcohol is a great example. It's possible to make alcohol products from 0.5% to 95%. Right. And some states will say that we're going to cap beer at X% or liquor at another percent. And kind of like the THC debate, we don't have a lot of studies to say, how healthy or not is 90% alcohol versus 50% alcohol products. But we can at least think about the pharmacology of alcohol and begin to have some rational policy discussions about what would be some sensible limits.
And advising psychiatrists probably to provide that information to parents, and for schools to know that, there's a huge difference between a Coors Light and a fifth of Everclear, and just being able to explain that in very simple terms.
I think one other thing about the, what is a rational cap, if there would be a rational cap for potency or strength, we could look to the medical data. THC, as I said, is an approved drug for certain conditions. I can prescribe it. Any doctor in America can. And we've done placebo-controlled trials on human volunteers. So we know from those studies that between probably 2.5 milligrams per day or 2.5 milligrams twice a day of THC is a starting point. And we also have advice from clinical experience that 20 milligrams a day is probably the end point. So between 2.5 milligrams to 20 milligrams, depending upon the experience of the consumer, that's where medicine has pegged the useful concentration ranges for oral use of THC.
Is that why an edible, for example, is 5 milligrams, so that it can be measured
Yeah.
And again, that's not at an FDA approved level, right? I mean, this is not a drug that FDA is recommending at this time, but you're saying that in practice, that's
Well, no,
about what
so that, I
you
mean,
know.
the FDA, the THC is available as a prescription drug, so we can use it. And it behaves in taking THC pill Marinol will be identical, more basically identical to taking a cannabis brownie. So it's just oral ingestion of THC. And so we know, we have a guidepost for ranges of that are useful and or intoxicating. We can then take those dosing numbers and translate this into, if I have a vaping pen, how many puffs per session am I likely to take, and how many milligrams can I get? So we can have some ballpark numbers to start thinking around what we might want to say is a limit to potency or to daily dosing. But right now,
What is that percentage? What is the percentage of THC if you're puffing, for example, as it relates to the milligrams of THC?
well, it's probably too. I mean, the math is probably too hard for me to do in my head right now, and maybe boring some people.
But I mean, like some weed is 33%, so the average consumer is, I guess what I'm asking is, they don't know really if you're using grass or a concentrate or a distillate. You don't know how many milligrams you're getting. I mean, it could be 600 milligrams.
Well, the higher the concentration in a distillate or a concentrate, then the easier it will be to take too much. So it's kind of like saying for ibuprofen, we sell that over the counter at 200 milligrams per pill. It's possible to make it into an 800 milligram pill. It's possible to make it into a 3,200 milligram pill. But if 3,200 milligrams of ibuprofen would be a bit dangerous. And to get to an overdose or to get to a dangerous level, I would have to take 16 tablets, which each tablet I ingest, I'm kind of having a little bit of knowledge I'm doing it. But if I have, say, a tiny tablet, and I can in one gulp take 3,200 milligrams, this is it's more risky that way. So
Okay.
higher potency invites greater risk of excessive dosing or of overdosing.
And this would, according to your presentation, increase your risk of psychosis.
Yeah, I mean, as everything goes in medicine, the higher the dose, the higher the risk, and so
Okay.
so a higher
That's good
dose
counsel.
to higher risk for psychosis for sure.
Okay. Our daughter had pot-induced psychosis on a campus in a state where pot is legal, but there was only THC in her urine test. Okay, so someone is commenting to agree with you. THC and vaping toxins mixed in together, so dangerous. So in some of the dabs, there's butane or some other chemicals, solvents that are run through them. And if they're only 90%, then it would be dangerous to have some of those leftover chemical residues, would it not, in your brain? In addition, those would be poisonous.
Yeah, well, I don't know to what extent, and I think each state, if they do it at all, probably has differing standards for quality in concentrate preparation. So you'd have to see what your state is recommending or regulating in terms of how to make it, and then you would have to probably do some investigation to make sure that people are doing it in line with the regulations, which may or may not exist. But in addition to like maybe residues from solvents that get used, the other concern is this. A way to make a concentrate is you take parts of the plant other than flour, and then you just mix them up with an organic solvent. So you can take less desirable parts of the plant and put them in a solvent mixture and get high concentrations of THC just through extraction of plant material. So as you go from bringing the THC from, let's say, 4% to 70%, you're also bringing forward not just THC, but every other compound that has soluble properties that are similar to THC. So you get the thing you're measuring is the THC, but cannabis plants have like 500 different chemicals in them. And I've not been convinced that extraction processes are paying attention to the other 499 chemicals that may be coming across in this concentration. So in addition to the possible extraction residues, it's quite possible that you're pulling forward God knows what kind of chemical from the plant as a co-precipitant, as well as potentially herbicides or pesticides or other sorts of agricultural chemicals that may have been used in the processing.
Interesting. And one last question, and then we are out of time. You mentioned an increased rate in suicide. If we know now, and we've seen from your presentation that marijuana can indeed cause psychosis, then can it also be stated that marijuana could then be a causal factor for suicide? Does that follow?
Well, see, we can go to human laboratories and we can induce some psychotic symptoms. We can do things that can get us to the outcome. But if the outcome is suicide, we can't. I mean, that you can't do that in a human study. So you can't say prove causality for suicide the way you prove causality for many other things. Having said that, though, there are data that there are epidemiological data that say that cannabis use is associated with higher risk of depression and higher likelihood of suicide. There is very interesting study was published within the last 2 years. It came out of Washington State. They were looking at users of medical marijuana who logged their symptoms in an app called StrainPrint. And the investigators got access to the StrainPrint database, and so they could say what strain they were using and what kind of psychological effects were happening. So they said in terms of mood that using medical marijuana had a brief elevation of mood, but after 1 year, depression scores were worse at the end than they were at the start. So there's that very interesting finding. And then in animal data, we see several studies in which long-term THC or long-term activation of the cannabinoid system actually turns off serotonin production. And serotonin is very important for mood stability or for mood maintenance, and serotonin depletion is very much related to suicide risk. And so in animal studies, we have seen several examples of long-term THC causing a biochemical change, which we know is very much related to suicide risk in humans. So there's a very concerning bit of data. Also,
and you mentioned too that
it negates the effect of antidepressant drugs in animal studies.
Wow. And in patients with schizophrenia, many of them attempt suicide at a higher rate.
Yeah, in schizophrenia, the suicide attempt rate is around 50%. So one out of 2 people will attempt it. And in schizophrenia, about 1 in 10 will die from suicide.
Wow. Well, this is scary and wonderful at the same time, because you were here to teach us all of this critical information, and this is recorded, and I hope everybody listening to this will send this out to everybody they know who has loved ones who are in the dangerous stage of brain formation until they reach their mid or to late 20s. Now we know, correct, Dr. Messamore, that it's very important that they protect their loved ones and their brains. Thank you so much, Dr. Messamore, for your time and for all of you being here, and appreciate you being one of Johnny's ambassadors. We'll hope to see you again soon. Take care.